Welcome to Day 76 on the Trail. We have 4 readings for today, from Acts 21 verses 27 through chapter 22 verse 29, Leviticus 12, 1 through 8, Proverbs 13 verse 1 through 14:35, and Tobit chapter 3 verses 7 through 17. In our continuing story from the book of Tobit, we find a parallel story developing with a relative of Tobit named Sarah. Now, like Tobit, Sarah is the victim of unjust and undeserved insults. Sarah has had 7 husbands who are killed by the demon Asmodeus before her marriage can be consummated. This leaves Sarah childless and the object of reproach by her father's maids. Now, we saw a similar theme of the societal disgrace of a childless wife in Genesis 16 in the story of Abram's wife Sarai and Hagar. Also, there may be a connection in this story from Tobit to a question asked of Jesus by some Sadducees in Mark chapter 12. In the story recorded in Mark's Gospel, the Sadducees are questioning Jesus' view of the resurrection, a resurrection from the dead, which they themselves do not acknowledge. So they propose to Jesus a conceptual scenario where 7 brothers marry the same woman, one after the other. However, they all die childless. Their question for Jesus then is, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had married her. The similarity to the story of Sarah in Tobit is striking. Now, as with Tobit, Sarah contemplates suicide due to her situation. However, her concern for her father and her family prevents her from continuing this action. Instead, we're provided with her prayer for God to act on her behalf. In this prayer, Sarah, like Tobit, asks God to release her from her life of suffering. In verse 13, she prays, "Command that I be released from the earth and not listen to such reproaches anymore." And then, at the end of her prayer, she adds in verse 15, "Already 7 husbands of mine have died. Why should I still live? But if it is not pleasing to you, O Lord, to take my life, hear me in my disgrace." Upon hearing the prayers of both Tobit and Sarah, God decides to help them by sending the angel Raphael, whose name means God is healed in Hebrew, to restore them. The white films fall from Tobit's eyes, restoring his vision. Then, while arranging the marriage of Tobias, Tobit's son, to Sarah, Raphael also frees her from the power of Asmodeus. And with all of this, we have only finished the first 3 chapters of Tobit. 11 more remain. From our reading in Acts. When Paul, at the direction of James, visits the temple, Jews from Asia recognize him. Now, this time, it is not Jewish Christians who instigate the problems for Paul. Instead, it is likely that among the crowd in the temple that day were Jews who had come from Ephesus, since they recognized Trophimus, an Ephesian. Paul's accusers assumed that Paul had brought a Gentile into the restricted portion of the temple courtyard. Now, according to the writings of Philo and Josephus, no foreigner was to enter a specific barricaded area which surrounded the temple and its enclosure, and anyone found trespassing would be responsible for their ensuing death. However, the claims of the Jewish agitators were completely unfounded in the case of Paul. Now, the charges levied against Paul regarding the supposed violation of the temple are not unique. For example, Stephen is falsely accused of speaking against the temple in Acts 16. In verse 13, it says, "They set up false witnesses who said, 'This man never stops saying things against this holy place and the law.'" Also, at Jesus' trial in Matthew 26, witnesses bring a charge. They say, "This fellow said, 'I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. The ensuing riot caught the attention of the Romans almost immediately. And this is because the fortress Antonia was located on the northwest corner overlooking the Temple Mount. Also, in the cry of the people in verse 36, when they say, "Away with him," we can hear echoes of the shouts against Jesus at his trial before Pilate. In Luke 23, verse 18, it says, "Then they all shouted out together, 'Away with this fellow.'" Now, in response to the growing hostility, the Romans come to rescue Paul. And Paul asks the tribune to speak to the crowd. Now, notice that he asks for permission from the Roman tribune in Greek, but speaks to the crowd in Aramaic, which demonstrates to the tribune that he is educated. This causes the tribune to realize that Paul is not an Egyptian Jew who, between AD 52 and 59, led 4,000 Sicarii, or daggermen, in a revolution against Rome. In Paul's speech to the crowd, he gives a second account of his conversion. The first description of Paul's encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus was given in Acts 9, and we will see a third recounting in Acts 26. But in this account before the crowd in Jerusalem, Paul makes special note of his connection to Gamaliel, his teacher, his respect for the Torah, and his identification with the Jewish people. But he also adds to the story that when he was praying in the temple, he was commissioned by Jesus to go to the Gentiles. In Acts 22, beginning in verse 17, Paul says, "After I had returned to Jerusalem, and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw Jesus saying to me, 'Hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.'" When the crowd is not satisfied with Paul's words, and the riot begins to gain steam, the tribune orders Paul to be flogged and examined. However, Paul reveals to the tribune that he is a Roman citizen, a citizenship which he attained by birth. One important point that we find in this encounter, which will carry through the remainder of Acts, is the willingness on behalf of the Romans, and by extension the Gentiles, to give Paul and his message about Jesus a fair hearing. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.